That definitely is there. Where to start? One thing I'd say is that the fact that I think like a historian means that I tend to have a different, maybe a more jaundiced view of arguments within the church where people bring out the concept of tradition. Such and such is traditional, or this, we can't change this because it's traditional. And the tradition that they're speaking of actually comes from the 19th century, or from, it's not really very old, but it has formed the world that they know, and so therefore it has this authority of tradition. And if I'm able to say, well, actually, the church did things differently from that for quite a long time, I find that I think like a historian when I'm thinking of kind of some debates within Anglicanism, to do with liturgy and so on, where some reforms, much like the reforms of the Protestant Reformation, are based on a claim that we're getting over all of this bad stuff that happened in between, like all of this nasty medieval accretion, and we're getting back to the intentions of the early church, which is where all the good stuff comes from. And as a historian, I'm kind of suspicious of that. I'm suspicious of the claim to recover original intention, something that I think you are also perhaps critical of in a different context. And I'm critical of the rejection of what comes between. Like, to me, that's all. In this sense, I have kind of a mind or a spirit that kind of is in sympathy with a point of view that some people would think of as more Catholic, right? In the sense that everything that happens in the church kind of adds to, it's all tradition, right? And it forms, it's sort of like, it all has to be weighed in as the church sort of figures out where it is. You can't just say, well, this whole period was wrong-headed, so we're going to go back to here. As a historian, that poses problems for me. But also, actually, another thing to foreground, Nathan would know, is that in terms of interpretation of Scripture, the historical critical method, the method that says, and that the important thing to focus on is understanding the passage in its historical context, and that's where you derive its principal meaning. That has been the dominant mode of scriptural interpretation for going on a couple hundred years. And there is now actually something of a reaction against it, because although no one would deny that understanding a biblical text in its historical context is important and a place where you've got to start, for the needs of the church, it's not where you end, right? And there's a criticism that a lot of preaching in particular over the past generations has not gone beyond a sort of historical critical approach, and it doesn't, it sort of leaves theology almost out, and we're doing something different in the church. Right? So, so in a case like that, I'm aware, like that sort of evokes mixed feelings. Again, when I first encountered this argument, because I sort of thought, well, is this somehow devaluing? I wish I had brought, there's a text that we read in one of my courses last year. It was, I think, Will Willimon and Stanley Howard was, where, I mean, they were being provocative in an early, I think it was possibly Willimon that wrote this, saying that the teaching of history in American schools is toxic to American Christian children, because it teaches them that history is driven by the engine of human affairs, and that God doesn't have anything to do with it. I'm caricaturing and sort of oversimplifying it, but the point I want to make is that when I read it, I got mad. Right? Like I thought, this guy has no respect for what I do. right? This guy doesn't understand. Of course, this is whichever of these theologians it was, these are very learned men, right? They knew what they were doing in writing that. They were meaning to be provocative, but it's another kind of like, slap on the head that says, whoa, this is a different discourse, right? It was kind of good to be exposed to that. So I think this might be a moment where we could kind of open the discussion to the audience if they have comments, questions. Students in the, oh, Jamie.
Has this experience changed how you understand history and practice as a historian, or will it? I mean, in some way, and maybe I'll be upfront about. I think the one thing I'm thinking about is this job interview that had at university, where she was asked, is God active in history? And she said no and didn't get the job. So that's not the question I want to ask you, but I think that's kind of what I'm thinking about, and what I'm sort of hearing, whether this is fair or not, is that there's these two different things kind of running in parallel, and I'm wondering if the theological stuff has leaked into, or do you think will leak into, the way in which you think what history is, the way it should be written about or researched, maybe what its purpose is, or something like that?
I think that time will tell, right? Right now I have a feeling more of sometimes two parallel tracks, and then sometimes a feeling like I just shouldn't be doing that. One way of answering your question, and who knows where this will go, but my research has been pointed towards the historical experience. My most recent research has been pointed towards the historical experience of parish clergy in 16th century England. And initially this was going to be a very kind of, I don't want to say conventionally, but a work of history that would rely largely on legal sources, where I would come to a kind of assessment about certain aspects of these men's lives and relations with their neighbors. I think it would be silly for me to think that I'm going to write the same kind of book about that now as I would before I felt a call to ministry or was ordained. In fact, the way I can see it is that perhaps this interest in this subject is part of the path towards where I am now. And so I've been mulling this over and over in my mind about, like, this might be an opportunity to write quite a radically different kind of book. Whether it would get published is another question, and by whom. But a book that really kind of foregrounds the subject of experience and the experience of ministry, given the continuities in the church and the discontinuities. I mean, I don't have an idea yet of how that would take shape. Maybe it won't in that form. But I think that that's one way of answering your question, is whether I think of it as leaking in or whatever, or as, I don't know, illuminating or cross-fertilizing or something. But I would say that in some way my historical work will be different, if I'm really being honest about it. Again, we are interested in our historical subjects for a reason, right? Like, there's a reason why we don't just sort of idly flip through a catalog and say, well, this looks like something I could do, or say, well, maybe some people more cynically say, well, here's an area where there isn't too much competition for jobs, so I'll write a dissertation here. Like, good luck, right? Like 5 years later, the picture will have changed. But I think that we are always attracted to our subjects for personal reasons, and so I think it can't help but happen.
Right.
Hopefully to the benefit of the writing of history.
That sounds very interesting, by the way. But it's sort of a question of interpretation you're talking about. And I think I'm just, and maybe I keep going back to the thing, because one of the things Catherine's reply to this question was, well, no, we can't. Like, that's not what we do. We can't start talking about how God is making historical events happen because it will basically blow up the historical profession, right? The whole point is to use evidence to gain knowledge about the past and assemble sort of a coherent, a logically coherent story about it. There's no way, in her mind at the time anyways, to bring sort of a God that's active in shaping historical events into that.
Mm-hmm. One way I'd respond to that is that there's two, and I think that this episode actually came to mind last year when I was answering some question, is that there's sort of two there's kind of an incompatibility there between two ways of viewing time, right? If God is active, if you're going to say that God is active in history, and one of our foundational assumptions about God is that God is outside of time, right? Then God's intervention into a human realm of mortal people who live and die in linear time is going to be something different than a historical figure, or a human intervention to that time. So you would have to you'd have to define much more clearly what you meant, right? It's not a simple question. I did find, by the way, that there is a discipline of historical theology, and I found it challenging to wrap my head around what theologians mean when they use the word, the much bandied around term history, because it certainly didn't seem to mean the same thing that I have been taught it meant. So sometimes this is a problem of language, a problem of terminology, and sometimes it's a problem of assumptions. So, Ella?
You still have schooling to finish, right? So how are you finding it? I don't know if you're doing any schooling right now, but how are you finding it juggling being a professor, teaching your courses, grading and such, as well as doing assignments in school still?
I'm very busy. I'm very, very busy. Because I'm also doing, at the same time as I'm doing that, I'm also being a theological student in a placement in a parish. And that is certainly not a burden. By far, the majority of my time is taken up with the university duties, but it is a challenge. And the way I look at that is like, welcome to the real world, right? Because this is the most likely future for me, is as, to use a currently a much bandied about term, bivocational ministry. So I will likely continue as a university professor and exercise ministry in relation to that. And so my time is going to be pretty full. And I think what it means is I'm really going to look forward to spring and summer. This year, spring and summer are going to be pretty busy too. But yeah, no, it's busy, and it's a good experience in terms of learning about personal boundaries, the amount of time that you can actually invest in this or that, which both professors on the one hand and clergy on the other are often bad at. But workaholism, in a sense, is a problem in both areas, and it's both vocations for different reasons, but perhaps analogous reasons, have a way of claiming all of your time. You could spend forever getting that lecture perfect, right? And perhaps the class isn't going to be a whole lot more successful than it would be if you spent half that time getting that lecture perfect. So there is, I think that academics and clergy both, in order to lead healthy lives, have to be very conscious of boundaries around and of self-care.
Or limits.
Yeah, and to draw a contrast, self-care is something that is talked about very explicitly in the church. It is not talked about in the academy very much, that I have heard. I'm not aware of a whole lot of ways that universities facilitate their professors either talking about or exercising good self-care.